There is a moment in 660 that the historical record does not linger on. It happens before the battle, before the cavalry, before the formations, before the first clash at a plain called Hwangsanbeol. It happens somewhere in the days before the march, in whatever space a senior Baekje general still called home, inside a kingdom that was already coming apart. A general named Gyebaek gathered his family, his wife, his daughters, and he killed them. The Samguk Sagi records this without ceremony. It preserves his stated reasoning. He feared his family would be captured and made into slaves, and believed that living in humiliation was worse than dying with clarity. Then it records what he did, and then it moves directly to the battle, as if the explanation, the act, and the march were all part of the same continuous motion. That compression carries its own weight, because what follows in the record is a battle that every Korean schoolchild knows. 5,000 Baekje soldiers against 50,000 Shilla. 4 repulsions. A 16-year-old Shilla warrior, captured, released, returned to fight again, captured a second time, and executed. And then the line breaking, and the road to Sabi opening, and Baekje beginning its final collapse into history. We know the ending before we begin. That is not the mystery. The mystery is the earlier moment. The question the chronicle states and then abandons. What kind of man does that? Not in the sense of moral judgment, though that question is also present and refuses to disappear, but in the more fundamental sense. What had he understood about the situation, and about himself, and about what was coming, that made this the decision he reached? And what kind of kingdom had arrived at the point where a loyal general of high rank believed this was the right thing to do before riding out to defend it? Gyebaek is remembered in Korea as a figure of loyalty, even tragedy. He appears in the Samguk Sagi with the seriousness of a man history felt obligated to preserve. His name became the title of a major television drama. He has a monument. He is commemorated. All of that memory coexists, without obvious discomfort in most tellings, with the fact that he killed his family. History tends to honor what a man did on the battlefield. It has been quieter about what he did at home, the morning he left. This is an attempt to hold both. Gyebaek died at Hwangsanbeol in the summer of 660. He lost the battle. He did not save Baekje. He did not prevent the Shilla-Tong alliance from dismantling one of the 3 kingdoms that had shaped the Korean peninsula for centuries. What he did was choose how to face a situation he could not survive, and then face it. That choice, in all its difficulty, in all its moral complexity, in all the things it reveals about the world he lived in, and the man he was, is what this story is really about. Most men preserved by history arrive in the record with context, a birthplace, a family lineage, a sequence of earlier events that explain how they became who they were at the moment history found them. We know where they came from, who trained them, what they did before the battle that preserved their name. Gyebaek arrives almost without any of this. His birth year is unknown. His early career, if it is preserved anywhere in surviving sources, does not survive in any form that allows us to trace it with confidence. We know from the Samguk Sagi that he held the rank of Dalsol, the second highest tier in Baekje's official 16-rank system. That detail matters. It tells us he was not a minor commander, or a man who rose only in the chaos of the final campaign. He was a senior figure in the Baekje court, a man with standing and authority accumulated over time. The rank of Dalsol placed him among Baekje's highest officials. But how he reached that rank, what campaigns he had fought before 660, what the court thought of him, whether he had enemies or patrons, or a political position within the factional landscape of Lake Baekje, none of this survives in recoverable detail. This absence is worth pausing over, because it is not accidental. When a kingdom falls completely, its records do not always survive with it. Baekje's administrative archives, its court documents, its genealogical registers, much of this was lost when Sabi fell, destroyed or scattered or absorbed into the administrative machinery of Shilla and Tang. What we know about Baekje comes largely through the Samguk Sagi, compiled in Goryeo in the 12th century, working from earlier sources shaped significantly by Shilla's perspective and by the centuries of distance from the events themselves. It comes through Tang Chinese records that framed the 660 expedition as imperial conquest. It comes through archaeology, through the ruins at Buya, through inscriptions and fragments. Shilla left descendants who wrote history. Baekje left ruins and a handful of names. Gyebaek is one of those names. His survival in the record is the survival of a man who did something at the very end that was too striking to set aside even from the perspective of those who had defeated him. He was not erased. He was not transformed into a villain the way that defeated kings sometimes were. He was preserved in outline at the moment of his death, almost fully formed. This is how losing sides tend to appear in history. They materialize when they are needed for the story the victors are telling, and they have no earlier chapters, no context, no world before the crisis. A Shilla general of comparable rank who fought at Hwangsanbeol would appear with ancestry, training, and subsequent career. Gyebaek appears at the edge of a plain with 5,000 soldiers and a decision already made. There is a strange dignity in this kind of preservation. He was not lost completely, but we should be honest about what it means. When we speak about Gyebaek as a person, as a man with a life before 660, we are working at the edge of what the evidence can support. What the record gives us clearly is what he decided in the final days of Baekje, and what he did with that decision. That is enough to take seriously. It is not enough to pretend we know more than we do. To understand why Gyebaek marched toward Hwangsanbeol, it helps to understand what Baekje had become by the summer of 660. From a senior general's perspective, the situation was already severely compromised before the battle was ordered. The Shilla-Tang alliance had been years in development. Kim Chunchu, who had become King Taejong Muyul of Shilla, had spent years searching for an outside power capable of breaking a military balance that neither Korean kingdom could resolve on its own. Baekje under King Uija had struck Shilla hard in 642, capturing the strategically vital Daeya fortress, and around the same period, taking more than 40 Shilla border positions. Those victories had demonstrated that Baekje could inflict serious damage. They had also, through the death of Kim Chunchu's daughter and son-in-law at Daeya, given Shilla's leadership a personal stake in what came next. Chunchu found Tang. Tang had its own reasons to engage. The Korean peninsula mattered to Tang's imperial ambitions in Northeast Asia. Baekje's western coastal position, its relationship with Japan, and its connection to Goguryeo in the north, made it a strategic variable that Tang could not ignore. When Shilla offered alliance, Tang saw a path to reshaping the peninsula on terms that served imperial expansion. When the combined force moved in 660, it moved with a scale designed to end Baekje as a functioning state. Tang General Su Dingfang crossed the sea with an army the records describe as 130,000. Those numbers carry political weight as well as military meaning, but the basic point is clear. This was an imperial expedition, not a border campaign. Shilla's Kim Yushin advanced by land with a force recorded at 50,000. Inside Baekje, the warnings had been given and not properly used. The officials Sung Chung and Hung Soo had identified the critical defensive points: Tan Hyun, the mountain pass, and Gyebaek Po, the western coastal approach. These were not symbolic locations. They were the gates through which the invasion would have to pass. If Baekje could hold them, the campaign would be slower, more costly, possibly negotiable. If they fell, or were not properly defended, the enemy would set the pace of the war. They fell, or were not properly defended. The western approaches were compromised. Tang forces were already pressing towards Sabi. What remained was to slow the Shilla land advance before it reached the capital. That task was given to Gyebaek. He received 5,000 soldiers. Against him, Kim Yushin's force numbered 50,000. The practical meaning of that ratio was not simply that Baekje would probably lose. It meant Gyebaek had no margin for ordinary military planning. He could not absorb casualties and reform. He could not trade ground for time in any sustainable way. He could not outlast the enemy through attrition, because attrition at a 10-to-1 disadvantage does not outlast anything. Every decision he made before the battle, including the one the Samguk Sagi records without elaboration, was made inside that arithmetic. He was a senior Baekje official who understood the military situation. He could read the numbers. He knew what Tan Hyun and Gyebaek meant, and he knew they had not saved Baekje. He understood that the road to Hwangsanbeol was not the beginning of a campaign. It was closer to the final page of one. The question is not whether he knew this. The question is what a man does with that knowledge when duty still requires him to march. The Samguk Sagi does not simply record the act. It records what Gyebaek said before he committed it. The text preserves his reasoning in his own words, or as close to his words as a chronicle compiled centuries later can bring us. The meaning is this: one man facing the combined armies of Tang and Shilla, with no certainty that the kingdom would survive. He feared that his wife and children would be taken captive and made into slaves. And he concluded that to live in humiliation was worse than to die with clarity. Then he killed them, and he marched. The record gives us more than most historical moments give us. It does not simply state what he did. It tells us how he explained it to himself, or how he explained it to someone who was present, or how the tradition remembered his explanation across the centuries. And yet the explanation does not close the question. It opens it. Because having his stated reasoning in front of us makes the act harder to hold, not easier. We know what he said. We can still ask whether what he said was the whole of it. And there are several layers available, each of them honest, none of them complete on its own. The first is the explanation Gyebaek himself offered, and it begins with what defeat in 660 would have meant for the family of a senior Baekje commander. In the warfare of this period, the households of defeated military leaders were not left in peace. They became property of the victors. Women could be taken as concubines or servants. Children could be absorbed into labor pools or distributed among officials as dependents. A general's family carried symbolic value as well as practical value. They could be displayed as evidence of conquest, used as leverage in negotiations, or simply absorbed into the domestic economies of those who had won. If Gyebaek believed, with the clarity of a man who could read the military situation, that Baekje was going to fall and that he was not coming back, then his family's future was not open. It was determined by whoever emerged from Hwangsanbeol with an army still standing. By killing them before the battle, in this reading, he was refusing that future on their behalf. He was choosing death over captivity, in a situation where he was the one with the authority to make that choice. The act becomes, in this framework, a final act of protection, terrible in form and arising from something that looked, from inside his understanding of the situation, like love. This interpretation is not wrong. It corresponds to the real conditions of 7th century warfare. It is also the interpretation that makes Gyebaek most legible as a patriot and a loyal figure, which is perhaps why it appears most often. But there is a second reading, less comfortable, that sits alongside it. A soldier who has already lost everyone he is protecting has nothing left that competes with the battle. He does not hesitate at the moment of decision because he is imagining his family's face. He does not hold back because he is thinking about a future he wants to return to. He has severed the psychological attachments that make most human beings, even in extremity, pull slightly away from the final commitment. In this reading, the killing was not only about protecting the family from captivity. It was also about removing the thing that might make a general hesitate. Gyebaek was not just sparing them a bad fate. He was making himself capable of the battle he needed to fight. The logic is brutal. It is also coherent. And it does not require that we choose between love and strategy. Both can be true at the same time. A decision that arises from grief and calculation simultaneously is not a contradiction. It is a description of how people make choices under extreme pressure. The third reading is the one that historical commemoration has found easiest to leave unasked. Gyebaek's wife and daughters did not march to Hwangsanbeol. Whatever they would have faced in defeat, slavery, concubinage, dispersal, they were not soldiers. The decision about whether to face that future was made for them, not by them. The record does not tell us whether they were given a choice or a moment of preparation. It states only that he killed them and left. History has honored Gyebaek as a patriot. That honor moves quickly past the question of what his family might have chosen had they been asked. It is not that the question is unanswerable, though it is. It is that the question has generally not been felt to be necessary. This is worth noticing, not as a verdict against Gyebaek, but as an observation about how memory works. The monument commemorates the general. The chronicle records the act in passing. The family does not have names in the surviving record. None of the three readings cancels the others. They exist simultaneously, which is probably the most honest way to hold what the chronicle gives us. A man can act from love and from calculation and from a kind of ruthless clarity all at once. A decision can be militarily coherent and morally unresolved at the same time. History tends to select one of these frames and settle into it, because monuments and textbooks require resolution. The record itself does not require that settlement. It states what happened and leaves the weight of it where it fell. At Hwangsanbeol, Gyebaek chose his ground. The plain in what is now South Chungcheong Province offered room for both sides to maneuver, but no natural fortification strong enough to compensate for the difference in numbers. What Gyebaek had against a force 10 times larger was the commitment of men who understood their situation and the tactical discipline to make each engagement cost the enemy more than raw numbers would suggest. The Samguk Sagi records 4 engagements before the battle ended. 4 times the Shilla army advanced on Gyebaek's line. 4 times the Baekje line held and drove them back. This tends to be described as miraculous, and the emotional logic is understandable. A force of 5,000 repelling 4 assaults from 50,000 sounds like the kind of thing that belongs in legend rather than chronicle. But the military explanation, while less romantic, is not obscure. A smaller force defending prepared positions against a numerically superior force attacking frontally can hold for longer than the numbers suggest, especially when the defenders have no fallback position that changes their situation. A retreating army must protect its retreat and manage its reformed line. An army that has already decided there is no meaningful retreat does not spend energy on that calculation. It spends energy on the assault in front of it. Gyebaek's soldiers had no destination behind them that mattered. Sabi was there, but Sabi was already in danger from Tong's western approach. The battle at Hwangsanbeol was not one gate among many. It was the last one that could be held, and everyone in Gyebaek's formation understood this. After 4 repulsions, Kim Yushin faced a problem that had less to do with tactics and more to do with soldiers. His army had not been broken. It had not suffered losses that made continuation impossible, but it had been checked 4 times by a force it should have overwhelmed. The psychological weight of 4 failed assaults against a drastically outnumbered enemy does not leave soldiers unchanged. It raises questions about what the defenders are made of. It creates hesitation at exactly the moment when momentum is supposed to be inevitable. Command credibility in this kind of situation requires an answer. The answer came in the form of a 16-year-old. Guanchang was a Hwarang, a member of Shilla's elite warrior culture that blended aristocratic identity with military training and a particular code of conduct. His father, Pu Mil, was a senior commander in Kim Yushin's army, and he had brought his son to the battle. The Samguk Sagi gives Gwanchang a short biography, unusual for someone who died so young, which suggests that what he did at Hwangsanbeol was considered worth preserving in detail. Gwanchang rode out toward the Baekje line alone. He was captured. He was brought before Gyebaek. What happened next is the moment in the battle that complicates any simple image of Gyebaek as a man who had extinguished his capacity for recognition of the people across from him. Gyebaek looked at Gwanchang. He was 16 years old. He had ridden alone toward a Baekje line that had repelled 4 assaults from 50,000 soldiers. Whatever that was, recklessness, courage, desperation to prove something, a boy trying to break a stalemate his elders could not. It was a particular quality that Gyebaek apparently recognized. He released him. He sent Gwanchang back to the Shilla side, alive and unharmed. The Samguk Sagi notes that Gyebaek said the boy was young, and that he could not bring himself to kill him. This is a small sentence in the record. It is also the most humanizing detail that survives from Gyebaek's side of the battle. The man who had killed his family that morning, who had organized 5,000 soldiers for a battle he knew he could not win, looked at a 16-year-old enemy and let him go. Gwanchang returned to his father. He received the kind of words that fathers give sons in moments like this, something between acknowledgement and encouragement. Then he turned his horse around and rode toward the Baekje line again. He was captured a second time. This time, Gyebaek had him executed. The Samguk Sagi says he sent the head back to the Shilla camp, attached to Gwanchang's horse. When Gwanchang's father received it, the grief of the moment became something the Shilla commanders could use. A 16-year-old had charged the Baekje line twice. He had been spared once and had returned anyway. He had died rather than accept his release as a reason to stop. If this boy could do that, the unspoken argument went, what exactly was the rest of the army holding back for? The 5th assault came. The Baekje line, which had held through 4 attacks by 50,000 soldiers, broke under the 5th. Gyebaek died in the fighting. The record does not preserve the moment or the manner. He disappears from the chronicle when the battle ends, the way a soldier disappears when the line he was holding is no longer there. There is something worth sitting with in the Gwanchang sequence, read against everything else we know about the day. Gyebaek had killed his family before dawn. He had organized a defense everyone knew was outnumbered. He had held the line through 4 assaults that should have been impossible to hold. And then, when a 16-year-old enemy rode at him alone, he looked at the boy and let him go. He was then put in the position of executing that same boy when Gwanchang returned. Neither the release nor the execution tells us what Gyebaek was. Together, they tell us everything we still cannot know. They show something more difficult. A man acting inside a set of obligations that were producing contradictory results, and navigating them with whatever coherence he had left. The mercy and the execution, and the family killing, and the 4 repulsions were not separate things happening to different versions of the same man. They were all the same man, in the same day, holding the same position. That is harder to put on a monument than loyalty alone, but it is closer to what the record preserves. After Hwangsanbeol, Sabi fell within days. King Uija fled and then surrendered. Members of the royal family, court officials, and thousands of people who had lived inside Baekje's capital were taken by Tang forces. Uija was sent to Loyang, the Tang imperial city, where he died in 661, far from the land that had made him a king. Baekje, which had existed as a kingdom for nearly 7 centuries, ceased to exist as a political entity. Gyebaek's stand at Hwangsanbeol had not changed this. 5,000 soldiers holding a plain for one day did not stop an alliance that had been years in formation and months in motion. The most important strategic decisions, where to station forces, which passes to hold, which warnings to act on, had already been made or missed before Gyebaek received his orders. He arrived at Hwangsanbeol at a point in the campaign when the gates that mattered were already open. The battle he fought was extraordinary. The situation that produced it was already decided, and yet his name survived. This requires an explanation, because history does not automatically preserve the names of commanders who lose. A battlefield is full of men who die fighting losing causes and leave no trace. Gyebaek is in Korean textbooks. He has a monument in Buya on the ground of what was once the Baekje capital. He has a drama series bearing his name. He is commemorated across a gap of nearly 14 centuries. Part of the reason is the battle itself. 4 repulsions at a 10-to-1 disadvantage is genuinely remarkable, regardless of the outcome. Military memory tends to preserve exceptional tactical performance, even inside losing campaigns, because what soldiers can do under extreme pressure reveals something worth recording. But the deeper reason may be what Korean historical culture has sometimes valued above strategic success: loyalty, faithfulness, the willingness to perform a duty completely, even when the outcome is not in doubt. A figure who fights when he knows he cannot win, who holds a position past the point where holding it can change anything, who does not survive to negotiate or explain himself to the victors. This figure fits a particular kind of ideal that does not depend on the result. Gyebaek committed completely. He removed every personal reason to hesitate. He stood until the line broke. He did not live to be taken captive, or to offer terms, or to adapt to the new political reality, the way that survivors sometimes do. That completeness is part of what history preserved. Baekje as a political entity was erased so thoroughly that its royal genealogies, its court records, its administrative documents are largely gone. The language of official Baekje is not something we can read in the way we can read Shilla's legacy, because Shilla survived to produce descendants who maintained and transmitted records. Baekje's disappearance from the documentary record is almost total. But the names of the men who stood at the end, some of them made it through. Not because Shilla wanted to honor them, but because what they did was too clear to misrepresent even for a history written by the other side. Gyebaek fought with 5,000 against 50,000. He held 4 times. He died where he stood. These are not the kinds of facts that require interpretation or political adjustment. They are simply what happened. And that may be why the record kept him, in outline if not in full, and why 14 centuries later, his name is still attached to the plain where he made his stand. The MBC drama, Gyebaek, released in 2011, gives the general a full biography that the historical record withheld. An origin, a family before the family he killed, a political world inside the Baekje court, a romance, a career that extends before 660 into the decades when Baekje was still capable of imagining a future. Drama does what history cannot. It fills the silence with a person. But the silence is also where the most honest version of Gyebaek lives. We do not know when he was born. We do not know what his wife's name was, or whether his daughters were children or young women. We do not know what he said to them, or whether he said anything. We do not know if he believed Baekje could be saved, or if he had already settled the question of the outcome, and was choosing only the manner of his part in it. We do not know whether the 4 repulsions at Hwangsanbeol surprised him or confirmed what he had expected. What we know is that he was there, that he held the line through 4 assaults, that when a 16-year-old enemy rode at him alone, he looked at the boy and let him go, and then was forced to execute him when the boy returned, and then watched his line break under the 5th assault, and then died somewhere in the collapse. Those facts taken together describe a man who was paying attention until the end. The mercy toward Gwanchang is not the mercy of someone who had stopped seeing the people across from him as people. Whatever Gyebaek had done that morning, he had not become unable to recognize courage in an enemy. He released the boy. That matters. It does not resolve everything, but it is a fact that the record preserved alongside the harsher ones, and it deserves to be held alongside them. The family killing remains the most difficult part of this story to carry. Korean memory has generally resolved it by placing it inside a framework of loyalty and sacrifice, where the harshness of the act becomes evidence of the depth of his commitment to Baekje. That resolution is available. It draws on real conditions of 7th century warfare. A general's family in defeat was genuinely at risk of the futures Gyebaek feared for them. But that resolution requires moving past the question of what his wife and daughters might have wanted if they had been given a voice in the matter. History has generally found it easier not to ask. The monument in Buyu honors the general. The chronicle records the act in passing. The family appears in the record only as what he did to them, and then they are gone. This is not an argument that Gyebaek was a villain. The conditions he faced were real, and the decisions he made arose from a coherent understanding of those conditions. But there is a difference between understanding a decision and settling it. And the family killing is a decision that should probably remain unsettled, because settling it, in either direction, requires pretending we know more than we do about the people involved and the choices they were or were not given. Baekje is gone. Its palace at Sabi is archaeological ground. Its royal line ended in a Tang imperial city. Its administrative records are largely lost. The language of its court does not survive in the way that Shila's legacy survived. But Gyebaek's name came through, preserved in a history written by the people who defeated him, recorded without obvious sympathy or embellishment, carried through 14 centuries in outline. History almost lost him. He appears in the record because what he did at the very end was too difficult to look away from, even from the other side of the battle. That is how some of the losers of history survive. Not by winning, not by being remembered kindly or completely, but by doing something at the last moment that even the victors could not find a reason to set aside. Gyebaek held 5,000 men at a plain called Hwangsanbeol against 50,000. He lost. He died. Baekje fell. And 14 centuries later, his name is still attached to the ground where he stood. That is not victory, but it is not nothing.